I'm going to show you how to sew the side seams. Once you have them pinned down the side, you are going to be sewing. Make sure before you sew that your two edges are right next to each other. You shouldn't have them being a separate distance, and you shouldn't have to cut it in order to get it to match. Okay, at the bottom, if the bottoms don't quite match up, if there's a little bit of difference here, that is okay. Just leave it for now. I'm going to be sewing my straight stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. But before I put my fabric in there, I want to make sure that my stitch length is at a 3. So I'm going to push this button again, I'm going to press it twice, so I'm at the very bottom one, and this 2.2, I'm going to push the plus until it says 3.0. Okay. Now I'm going to be back on my stitch 1, on my straight stitch, and I'm going to put in the edge of my fabric so that it lines up with the 5/8 line on my sewing machine, so that I know I have a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay. Now if I start right on the very edge of my fabric, sometimes it will jam up and kind of get stuck in the sewing machine. So when I start, I want to start about 1/4 of an inch in so that I am not going to end up jamming up the machine before I even start. So I'm going to start a little bit in, and then when I backstitch, I can go all the way back to the top. Okay, I'm going to take out my first pin so I don't run it over with the needle, and I'm going to push on my foot control. So I'm going to go forwards a couple stitches, hold my reverse to go back to the beginning, and then I'm going to go forwards again. And remember, I'm watching right here to make sure I'm staying straight at the 5/8 of an inch line. And when I get to the pins, I take them out before I get there. And I'm just sewing a straight line all the way down the side of my shorts. Make sure you keep your fingers away from the needle so that you don't end up sewing over them on accident. And then when you get to the bottom, you're going to backstitch again. So I'm going to hold my reverse, and I'm going to go forwards to the end, and then I can take my fabric out and cut my threads. After you sew your straight stitch, you're going to be ready to trim. Okay, you sewed a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now you're going to trim that in half so you have at least 1/4 of an inch left. Okay, so I'm going to start down here, and I'm just going to cut half of my seam allowance off. When I do this, it makes sure that the fabric is right next to each other. Make sure that the fabric is right next to each other, and I am trimming my seam allowance in half, and when I do this, it makes it so that the fabric is right next to each other, even if I didn't line it up perfect. So when I do my zigzag stitch, it's going to go on and off the edge of my fabric. Okay, so I'm trimming, so I have at least 1/4 of an inch seam allowance left. So I'm cutting it in half. Okay, after I trim it in half, I'm ready to finish the seam. So I have to change my stitch number from number 1, so the number's up at the top, or the light's up at the top. I have to change that to number 8, so I will be ready for a zigzag. And when I put my fabric in, I line it up in between the 2 toes of the presser foot, and I'm going to sew. Okay, I'm going to reverse, so I do my back stitch at the beginning, and then I zigzag all the way down the edge. You slow down when you get to the end and reverse for your back stitch. And go forwards, and you can take it out and cut your threads. And then you're going to finish the other side the same way. So you sew a 5/8 seam allowance, you trim the seam allowance in half, and you do the zigzag finishing stitch on the edge. Once you're finished sewing, you're going to be ready to go back to the irons to press the seam open.